As we continue our reading through the Sermon on the Mount, we're finding that we're really starting to explore the depths of Jesus' teaching and how it can get into the really uncomfortable parts of our lives. This morning, Radhika addressed the previous section of the text with topics like anger, adultery, and divorce. And that sermon should be on our YouTube channel on Tuesday, and I would encourage you to take a look. But it doesn't get any simpler for us tonight, though. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. These are not easy, happy ideas, but maybe that's the point, because life isn't easy and it isn't always happy. In this passage, we hear the words, "You have heard that it was said," twice. It's a continuation of the teaching pattern that Jesus uses in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, where he will recite a familiar rule or law or societal understanding, and then he will elaborate on it, or he'll confront it, or he'll override it. Jesus speaks into the corporate knowledge of the time and teaches the people from that place. And so if we're going to explore these teachings of Jesus, we should probably go back to the starting point. And so when Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said," we had better make sure that we know what was said. But before we get there, there's something else we need to keep in mind. We need to keep in mind who Jesus was talking to. Way back in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, we hear that Jesus is speaking to both the disciples and to the crowd, the ordinary, everyday people, the masses, the people who are sitting under the religious rule of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and under the occupation of the Roman Empire. These are oppressed people. And this is important for us to hear, because when we start to think about things like retaliation and enemies, the power dynamics at play are different. So first up, we have, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." So where have we heard that this was said? This idea appears 3 times in the Torah, in the Old Testament, once each in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And in Leviticus it reads, "Anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered." Now on the surface, this would seem to be a mandate for revenge, for retaliation. If you hurt me, then I can hurt you in return. We cannot escape the violence of this idea, but when we look a little closer, we can see that even in here, there is an element of justice. Hear it again with some added emphasis. "Anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return." Only fracture for fracture, only eye for eye, only tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. What this law is designed to do then is actually limit violence. It limits retaliation. If I am harmed by you, I cannot respond by harming you more, and then harming your family, and then your business, and then your village. I am limited to responding only in kind. So at its theoretical best, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is about concluding conflict. We are now even, so now we can move on. But when we consider the reality of violence, it's pretty obvious that it doesn't work like that. Violence breeds violence. And that's where the teaching of Jesus comes in to show us another way. "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile." The danger of this passage is pretty apparent, because on one level it seems to say, you know what, suck it up, princess. I mean, it clearly says, do not resist an evildoer. So take the pain, take the punishment, take the trauma, be a doormat, be a pushover. It's a troubling idea. And even more troubling if we think back to the original audience of oppressed people. Hey, you who are being oppressed, we all have our burdens to bear, so shh. I think the core issue here is how we understand the word resist and how it's translated. The translation from the original Greek has this word meaning to forcefully declare one's personal conviction or to stand against. Forcefully. To respond with force. To respond with violence. So perhaps a better way for us to hear this is do not resist an evildoer with violence. And that would make sense because this is exactly what is modelled in Jesus' first example. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And yet, still, it could seem like this is simply doormat behaviour. But there are a few details for us to keep in mind. First, despite appearances, the sufferer in this example is not doing nothing. They are not simply letting violence happening to them. They are using what power they have in order to respond, even if it is as little as turning their other cheek. The other thing to keep in mind is the practicalities at play. First, we're living in a right-handed world. So if you're left-handed like me, we've probably already had it beaten out of us. So, if I'm to punch forward with my right hand, I would also hit you on the left cheek, straight ahead. But Jesus specifically refers to the right cheek. Now, I can't use my left hand. Why can't I use my left hand? Poo hand. That's my poo hand. I'm not going to touch anyone with my poo hand. So that leaves, if I can't punch with my right hand or my left hand, I'm left with my backhand of my right hand. I can give you a backhanded slap on your right cheek. And so if you think back to any movies or TV shows where you've seen this happen, you know that it's not a fighting technique. It's not really even about giving physical harm. I could do a lot more damage with my fist, obviously. No, this is about exertion of power. This is about admonishment. This is about humiliation of the inferior. So for Jesus' scenario to have played out, the sufferer would have had to have been backhanded on the right cheek as a means of admonishment or humiliation. But now imagine that instead of cowering, the sufferer stands their ground. They do not respond with violence, but instead they turn their other cheek. This action robs the perpetrator of their power to humiliate. And in doing so, by turning their cheek, they force the perpetrator to find a different way to respond. They can no longer backhand with their right hand, which makes a strike of the fist much more likely. Now, this doesn't stop the violence, obviously, and in fact, it may make it worse. But in doing so, it changes the dynamics of the interaction because in Jewish culture, striking with a fist is reserved for equals. What we are seeing here is the development of what we call nonviolent resistance, a way of actively responding to conflict or oppression without resorting to violence. And one thing that the cheek example helps us to realise is that engaging in nonviolent resistance does not remove us from violence, but instead gives us a basis by which we can choose to respond to violence with nonviolence. The second example of Jesus helps us explore this further. It doesn't talk about physical violence, but instead the violence of economic oppression. If anyone wants to sue you and to take your coat, give your cloak as well. So how does this one work? Well, this one takes place in the public sphere, in a court of law. And if all you have in the world is the clothes on your back, then you are very poor indeed. And so if they take your coat and you give them your cloak, you make a very public statement that economic oppression of the poor attacks your very humanity. But some scholars want to take this further and want to see this as an even more powerful statement and suggest that by losing both your coat and your cloak, you in fact become naked. Now, nakedness is taboo in Jewish culture, and it brought shame not upon the one who was naked, but upon the one viewing the naked person. And so the one who takes your coat and then is given your cloak becomes shamed by the actions that they themselves have initiated. And again, it is the one who is seemingly powerless that has the opportunity to act, to give their cloak as well. It's the third one that's perhaps my favourite. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, and go also the 2nd mile. It's also the one that perhaps has been most misused, because no doubt we have heard the statement, go the 2nd mile, as a good thing, as a selfless thing, doing more than what's required. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it's not exactly what this statement is about. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, this is still about force. It's still about oppression. This is still about another act of violence. But let's explore some more context. Because it turns out in the Roman Empire there is a rule that a soldier could force a peasant to carry their gear for 1 mile. We actually see a version of this as part of the gospel story later in Matthew, when the Roman soldiers force Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross of Jesus. So remember, we're still immersed in the midst of Roman oppression. And again, what we discover is the opportunity for the powerless to actually act. You are ordered to carry a soldier's pack, but instead of stopping after the required 1 mile, you go 2. And by doing so, you are creating the situation where the soldier is now in violation of Rome's own rule. And it's my favourite because of the visual that comes with it. Can you imagine that the rude, aggressive Roman soldier ordering you in your own country to carry his pack for a whole mile? But when you reach that mile, he expects you to stop, but you don't. And then he has to chase you down to retrieve the pack which he forced upon you in the first place. The theologian Walter Wink, who has done much of the work in articulating the nonviolent resistance of this passage, writes this of the resisting civilian. Why would he want to do that? What is he up to? Normally soldiers have to coerce people to carry their packs, but this Jew does so cheerfully and will not stop. Is this a provocation? Is he insulting the legionnaire's strength? Is he being kind? Is he trying to get him disciplined for seeming to violate the rules of impressment? Will this civilian file a complaint? Will they create trouble? This act of non-violent resistance creates both confusion and again draws attention to a system that is inherently unfair. It is using the systems of injustice to make that very injustice visible to everyone. And this passage as a whole tells us the opposite of what many expect. It encourages, if not instructs us, to be agitators, to be politically engaged, to demonstrate faith in public, and to, above all else, be non-violent. But then, we're hit with what might be the most difficult commandment in the whole of the Bible. Love your enemies. You have heard it said that you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. I don't think it gets any harder than that. Love your enemies. So unlike the first instance of you have heard it said that has its source in the Torah, this one is a little more uncertain. Instead of reimagining a biblical passage, Jesus seems to be addressing more of a societal sensibility. I mean, it kind of makes sense. Love your neighbour, hate your enemies. And yet once again, Jesus challenges what we might usually understand to be sensible. The Sermon on the Mount as a whole deals with a range of different issues: murder, adultery, anger, divorce, issues that don't often seem to be related directly with one another. And it could seem that this is another instance where we've suddenly switched to a different topic. But I want us to think about this differently. That this notion of loving our enemies is directly related to the concept of non-violent resistance. And it's important that these two are linked, in that it would be possible to consider the scenarios that they would have an edge of vindictiveness. They are about creating conflict, so it would be easy for them to be about just shaming the one who is suing, shaming the soldier, shaming the violent one. And where, can we ask, is the love in that? I think that this is not a simple love that Jesus is talking about. It's not a superficial love. It's a love that is willing to get its hands dirty. Think about it this way. Think for a moment about those who you truly love. Could be family, friends, partners, kids, whoever. And then think about what it is that you expect from them. I think about Radhika, who I love, and in the depth of that love comes an expectation that she is good, and that she will try and do her best, she will try and do what is right. In the context of our love, she and hopefully I are held to a higher standard for one another. We try to help each other to be better, and we can hold one another to account. So when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, I believe it's the same kind of love. A love that enables us to say, you are better than this. You are one of God's children and you are better than this. And so acts of non-violent resistance shouldn't be about vindictiveness, but about us saying in words and action that you are better than this. I know you and I love you, and I can honestly say that you are better than this. Friends, it's no secret that the world is going through a tumultuous time. It's getting harder and harder to predict what tomorrow will bring. But if I had to guess, that if we, and by we I mean both as individuals and us as the body of Christ, if we do nothing, then the voices of compassion, the voice of justice, the voice of love will continue to be drowned out by voices of fear and hate and intolerance. Jesus said, let's love our enemies. So let's do that. Let's love those who create fear, who create hate, who create intolerance, and love them with a fullness that says, I won't let you get away with this because I know that you are better than this. Let's find ways, new and creative ways, to challenge the oppressive forces of this world, even if it's not about us. That we might show Christ's love and justice to all that we meet. In the name of the Blessed Trinity of Love, Amen.